The blood-stained chestnut mare limped into Dustwater Creek at dawn, her rider's saddle empty save for a single folded letter tied with twine to the pommel. Sheriff Beaumont Cray dropped his coffee cup, watching ceramic shards scatter across the porch planks as recognition struck him like a physical blow. That was Copperwind, and if she'd returned alone, then Kieran Holloway wasn't coming home. The war had ended 3 months ago, but its ghost still haunted every dusty street and weathered storefront in their small Texas town. Young men had marched, away with brass buttons gleaming and patriotic songs on their lips. Few had returned, and those who did carried shadows in their eyes that hadn't been there before. Kieran had been among the last to leave, promising his sweetheart Magnolia Fairweather that he'd return by Christmas with enough saved wages to buy the old Henderson ranch. Now his horse stood trembling in the town square, foam flecked around her muzzle, her coat dark with sweat and something that looked suspiciously like dried blood. The townspeople emerged from their morning routines, like moths drawn to flame. Widow Prescott clutching her shawl, blacksmith Augustus Kane wiping grease from his massive hands, Dr. Cornelius Vaughn already reaching for his medical bag, though it was clear no doctoring could help whatever had befallen the mare's rider. Magnolia appeared in the doorway of the general store, her face pale as fresh cotton. She'd been working there since her father died, keeping the books and tending customers while waiting for word from the front. Her hands shook as she took in the sight of Copperwind, understanding immediately what the horse's return meant. Sheriff Cray approached the mare slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones. Copperwind had always been skittish around strangers, but she allowed him to stroke her neck and examine the letter secured to her saddle. The paper was travel-worn and stained, but Kieran's careful handwriting was unmistakable across the front. For Magnolia to be opened only if Copperwind returns without me. The sheriff's weathered fingers hesitated over the knots. Opening another man's final words felt like trespassing on sacred ground. But Magnolia stepped forward, her chin raised, despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's addressed to me," she said quietly. "I'll read it." As she untied the letter with trembling hands, Dr. Vaughn examined the horse more closely. Copperwind bore wounds that spoke of a violent encounter, claw marks along her flanks that were too deep and too widely spaced to have come from any domestic animal. The dried blood on her coat wasn't all her own either. Something had attacked both horse and rider, and only one had survived. The town held its collective breath as Magnolia unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the first few lines before her face crumpled. Whatever Kieran had written, it wasn't the simple farewell they'd all expected. This was something else entirely, something that would change everything they thought. They knew about where he'd gone and why Copperwind had returned alone. Magnolia's voice cracked as she read the opening lines aloud, her words carrying across the hushed town square like leaves on an autumn wind. "My dearest Magnolia, if you are reading this, then I have failed in my mission, and Copperwind has proven herself the bravest soul I've ever known." Mission? Sheriff Cray exchanged glances with Dr. Vaughn. Kieran had enlisted with the 8th Texas Cavalry, not some special assignment. The war was over. What mission could he possibly have been pursuing? Magnolia continued reading, her voice growing steadier with each word despite the tears. "The war may have ended for most folks, but there are things stirring in the mountains west of San Antonio that require a different kind of fighting. 3 weeks ago, I received word from Captain Mordecai Sloan that entire homesteads were being found empty, not burned or raided, but simply abandoned, as if the families had vanished into thin air." The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the mystery unfolding in Kieran's careful script. Widow Prescott crossed herself, muttering prayers under her breath, while blacksmith Augustus Kane's massive frame tensed as if preparing for a fight. The army couldn't spare men for what they deemed wild tales, but Captain Sloan knew better. He'd seen the evidence himself: doors left standing open, meals half-eaten on tables, livestock wandering free but unharmed, no bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle, just empty homes where families should have been. Dr. Vaughn stepped forward, his medical training making him skeptical of supernatural explanations. "Disease could cause people to flee," he suggested quietly. But Magnolia shook her head and continued reading. "We tracked the missing families into the Perdido Mountains. following signs that no ordinary tracker could read. The trees themselves seemed wrong-twisted in ways that nature never intended, their bark bearing symbols carved by no human hand. Copperwind sensed the danger before I did, shying away from paths that looked safe to my eyes but felt wrong to her animal instincts. Sheriff Cray felt a chill run down his spine despite the warming morning sun. He'd heard whispers of strange happenings in the remote mountain regions, but he'd dismissed them as the fevered imaginings of war-traumatized minds. Now, hearing Kieran's methodical account, those whispers took on a more sinister cast. On the 5th day, we found them, or what was left of them. The missing families were gathered in a clearing deep in the mountains, but they weren't the same people who had disappeared from their homes. Their eyes were empty, black as midnight, and they moved with a purpose that wasn't their own. Something had taken them, Magnolia. Something that wore human faces, but harbored an ancient hunger. Magnolia's hands shook as she read the next passage, and several townspeople stepped back as if the words themselves carried contamination. The rational world they'd known, a world of cattle drives and crop failures, of market prices and weather patterns, was crumbling with each sentence. Captain Sloane tried to approach them, thinking they might be survivors in need of help. The thing that had been Mrs. Henderson turned toward him, and I saw recognition flicker in those black eyes. It smiled with teeth that were too sharp, and spoke with a voice like grinding stone. "More have come to join us. How wonderful." The letter detailed their desperate escape, how something pursued them through the twisted mountains with inhuman persistence. Captain Sloane hadn't made it past the second night, dragged screaming into the darkness while Kieran and Copperwind fled for their lives. "I'm writing this by firelight, hoping the flames will keep them at bay until dawn," the letter continued. "If I don't survive to bring word of this threat, then others must know. The thing in the mountains isn't finished, it's growing stronger, collecting more souls for whatever dark purpose drives it. Someone must warn the towns, must prepare for what's coming." Magnolia's voice faltered as she reached the letter's most harrowing passage, the paper trembling in her grip like a captured bird. The townspeople had drawn closer, forming a tight circle around her as if their proximity could somehow shield them from the words she was about to speak. "The creatures, for I can no longer think of them as people, began hunting us at nightfall. Copperwind's instincts saved us more than once, her ears pricking at sounds I couldn't hear, her muscles tensing before danger revealed itself. They move through the forest like shadows given flesh, making no sound except when they choose to torment their prey with whispered promises." Dr. Vaughn noticed several women in the crowd, reaching for their children, pulling them closer. Even hardened men like Augustus Kane shifted uncomfortably, their hands moving unconsciously toward weapons they weren't carrying. On the 3rd night of our flight, I understood the true horror of what we faced. The things pursuing us weren't merely predators, they were former victims, people who had been transformed into something else entirely. I recognized young Timothy Fletcher among them, the banker's son who had disappeared from his ranch 2 months ago. His face still held traces of the boy I'd known, but his eyes were pools of absolute darkness, and his voice carried harmonics that human throats were never meant to produce. Sheriff Cray's jaw tightened. He remembered the Fletcher boy, barely 18, full of dreams about expanding his father's cattle operation. The whole community had assumed he'd fallen victim to bandits or wild animals. The truth was far worse. They spoke to me as they hunted, calling out promises of reunion and peace. "Join us, Kieran," they whispered from the darkness. "Your pain will end. Your loneliness will end. You'll never have to say goodbye again." Their words carried a terrible weight, as if the air itself was trying to drag me toward them. Magnolia paused, wiping tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. The letter was beginning to blur in places where Kieran's own tears had fallen, making some words difficult to decipher. Copperwind began to show signs of the same darkness that infected the people, not the complete transformation I witnessed in others, but something subtler. Her eyes would glaze over for moments at a time, and she would try to turn toward sounds that weren't there. I realized that prolonged exposure to these creatures was affecting her too, slowly but surely drawing her toward their influence. The mare in question stood quietly now, no longer trembling, but eerily still. Dr. Vaughn studied her more carefully, noticing details he'd missed in his initial examination. Her eyes, while not the absolute black Kieran described in the transformed victims, held flecks of unusual darkness that seemed to shift and move in the morning light. I made a desperate decision on the fourth night. Rather than continue fleeing and risk Copperwind's complete corruption, I chose to make a stand. Using techniques Captain Sloane had shared before his capture, I created a barrier of salt and iron around our camp, reinforced with symbols he claimed held power against such creatures. The letter described a night of terror as the transformed victims circled their makeshift sanctuary, testing its boundaries with increasing aggression. They alternated between pleading with human voices and shrieking with sounds that belonged to no earthly creature. The barrier held until dawn, but I knew it was temporary protection at best. These things were patient, ancient in their malevolence, and they had all the time in the world. I couldn't outrun them forever, and I couldn't bear the thought of Copperwind falling under their complete control. As Magnolia read on, the crowd learned of Kieran's final gambit, a risky plan that would either free them from pursuit or doom them both. He had discovered references in Captain Sloane's notes to a ritual that could sever the connection between the creatures and their influence, but it required a sacrifice that no man should have to make. I'm writing these final words as I prepare to enact the ritual. If it succeeds, Copperwind will be free to return home, carrying this warning to those who must know. If it fails, then God help us all, because something far worse than war is coming to Texas. The letter's final pages crackled in the morning breeze as Magnolia turned them with reverent care, each word carrying the weight of Kieran's final hours. The townspeople pressed closer still, their faces reflecting a mixture of disbelief and growing dread. The ritual Captain Sloane described requires the willing sacrifice of one's deepest connection to the living world. Kieran had written in increasingly shaky handwriting. For most men, that would be their own life. But I realized there was something I valued more than my existence, my bond with you, Magnolia, and my promise to return home. Magnolia's breath caught in her throat, and several women in the crowd dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Sheriff Cray found himself thinking of his own wife, buried these past 5 years, and the promises he'd made at her graveside. The ritual demanded that I sever my connection to everything that made life worth living, channeling that sacrifice into a protective barrier around Copperwind. I had to let go of our future together, our dreams of the Henderson Ranch, even my memories of your laugh. The magic required me to give up my very identity as the man who loved you. Dr. Vaughn noticed the crowd shifting restlessly, some looking toward their own homes as if suddenly aware of their vulnerability. The rational part of his mind still rejected the supernatural elements of Kieran's account, but the evidence stood before them in the form of Copperwind's unnatural stillness and the strange markings on her flanks. As I began the ritual at midnight, the transformed victims sensed what I was attempting. Their attacks on the barrier intensified tenfold, and I could hear them screaming in voices that belonged to people I'd known and cared about. Young Timothy Fletcher begged me to stop, claiming the ritual would damn them all to eternal suffering. But I recognized the lie in his words. These things feared what I was about to do. The letter described arcane symbols drawn in salt and ash, words spoken in a language that predated human civilization, and a gradual tearing sensation as Kieran felt pieces of his soul being stripped away to fuel the protective magic. The pain was beyond description, not physical agony, but something deeper. I felt my love for you being pulled from my heart like threads from a tapestry, each memory of our time together becoming fuel for the barrier protecting Copperwind. I held your image in my mind until the very last moment, knowing I would never again be able to recall the sound of your voice or the way sunlight caught in your hair. Magnolia pressed the letter to her chest, sobbing openly now. The crowd had fallen completely silent except for the rustle of wind through their clothes and the distant sound of Copperwind's labored breathing. The ritual reached its crescendo. As dawn approached, I felt myself dissolving, not into death but into something far more terrible, a conscious existence stripped of everything that had made me human. The creature's influence over Copperwind shattered like glass, but the price was my transformation into something else entirely. Sheriff Cray stepped forward, his voice hoarse with emotion. What happened to him? What became of Kieran? Magnolia's eyes scanned the final paragraph, and her face went pale as morning mist. He writes, I am no longer the man who loved you, but I retain enough awareness to complete this warning. The ritual-worked Copperwind is free and protected from their influence, but I have become something between the living and the transformed, conscious but no longer human. I cannot return to Dustwater Creek, for I would bring only sorrow to those who remember the man I was. The letter concluded with instructions that chilled everyone present. The creatures in the Perdido Mountains will spread if not stopped. They grow stronger with each soul they claim, and their hunger is limitless. Organize the towns. Gather men with strong wills and pure hearts, and march against them before they march against you. Look for the signs: abandoned homes, livestock wandering free, and trees bearing symbols that hurt to look upon. A postscript written in different handwriting that was somehow both familiar and alien added a final warning. I will guard the mountain passes as long as I am able, but my strength wanes with each passing day. Do not seek me out, for I am no longer someone you would wish to find. Remember the man I was, not the thing I have become. The guardian of the pass. In the heavy silence that followed Magnolia's reading, the morning sun climbed higher over Dustwater Creek, casting long shadows that seemed to writhe and shift across the dusty ground. Sheriff Cray was the first to break the spell of Kieran's words, his weathered hands clenching and unclenching as he processed the implications. Folks, I know this sounds like something from a penny dreadful, but we can't ignore the evidence standing right here. He gestured toward Copperwind, whose strange stillness had become more pronounced as the morning wore on. That horse has traveled hard and far, and those marks on her flanks, I've seen wolf attacks and bear maulings, but nothing that leaves wounds like that. Double quotes. Dr. Vaughn knelt beside the mare, running his hands along her neck in a professional examination. Her pulse is abnormally slow, and her body temperature is several degrees below normal. There's something affecting her physiology that I can't explain through conventional medicine. Blacksmith Augustus Kane stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the gathered crowd. My grandfather used to tell stories about things in the deep mountains. Said there were places where the old spirits still held sway, places where civilized folk shouldn't venture. I always thought they were just tales to keep children from wandering off. Widow Prescott clutched her shawl tighter, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 weeks ago, my nephew Jasper was supposed to visit from his homestead near the foothills. Never showed up, never sent word. I thought maybe he'd taken ill or got held up by business. One by one, other townspeople began sharing similar stories. Missing travelers, abandoned farms discovered by passing merchants, livestock found wandering without their owners. Taken individually, these incidents could be explained by any number of mundane causes. Together, they painted a picture that aligned disturbingly well with Kieran's account. Mayor Dalton Westbrook, a portly man who preferred negotiation to confrontation, mopped his brow with a silk handkerchief. Now see here, we can't go making decisions based on ghost stories and mysterious letters. This is 1866, not the Dark Ages. There has to be a rational explanation. Rational like empty homesteads and missing families, challenged Augustus. Rational like young Fletcher disappearing without a trace. Sometimes the rational explanation is that there are things in this world we don't understand. Magnolia folded the letter carefully, her tears having dried into grim determination. Kieran wouldn't have written this if he wasn't certain. He was the most practical man I knew. Never believed in anything he couldn't see with his own eyes or touch with his own hands. If he says these creatures are real, then they're real. Sheriff Cray nodded slowly, his decision crystallizing. I believe him too. Question is, what do we do about it? Kieran's instructions were clear: gather men with strong wills and pure hearts. March against these things before they spread further. The crowd erupted in nervous chatter. Some voiced eager support for action, their blood stirred by the prospect of righteous battle. Others expressed skepticism and fear, questioning whether a small town could stand against supernatural threats that had claimed entire families. Dr. Vaughn stood up from his examination of Copperwind, brushing dust from his knees. If we're seriously considering this course of action, We need to approach it methodically. Kieran mentioned specific defensive measures: salt, iron, certain symbols. We should research these thoroughly before attempting any confrontation. The preacher's got old books in the church basement, suggested Widow Prescott. Father McKinnon collected all sorts of texts before he passed. Might be something useful there. Mayor Westbrook raised his hands for attention. Even if we accept this fantastic tale at face value, we're talking about organizing an armed expedition into dangerous territory. The liability alone, liability? Augustus's voice boomed across the square. What about our liability to protect our neighbors, to our children and their future? If these things are spreading like Kieran says, how long before they reach Dustwater Creek? The debate continued for another hour, with practical concerns warring against moral imperatives. Some argued for seeking help from the army. Others insisted that time was too precious to waste on bureaucracy. Through it all, Copperwind stood motionless, a living reminder of the cost of inaction. Finally, Sheriff Cray called for order. Here's what we're going to do. I'm calling for volunteers, men and women both. Anyone with the stomach for dangerous work. We'll spend 3 days preparing, gathering supplies, and learning what we can about these creatures. On the 4th day, we ride for the Perdido Mountains. 23 hands rose in the morning air, including magnolias. The die was cast 3 days later. As the first pale light of dawn touched the rooftops of Dustwater Creek, 23 determined souls gathered in the town square with horses, weapons, and supplies that represented everything the community could spare. Sheriff Cray surveyed the unlikely army before him: shopkeepers and farmers, widows and young men barely old enough to shave, united by a common purpose that would have seemed impossible just days before. Dr. Vaughn had spent countless hours in Father McKinnon's basement, emerging with leather-bound volumes that spoke of ancient protections and supernatural threats. The symbols Kieran had mentioned in his letter matched illustrations in texts dating back centuries, confirming fears that whatever lurked in the Perdido Mountains was far older than the recent disappearances suggested. Salt circles hold them at bay, Dr. Vaughn explained to the assembled group, his medical bag now supplemented with pouches of blessed salt and iron filings. Iron weapons can wound them, but only if wielded by someone with absolute certainty in their purpose. Doubt weakens the metal's effectiveness. Augustus Kane had worked tirelessly at his forge, crafting arrowheads and bullets from the purest iron he could find. His massive hands, usually steady as stone, had trembled slightly as he inscribed protective symbols onto each projectile. "Never thought I'd be making ammunition for fighting monsters," he'd muttered. But his work was flawless despite his reservations. Magnolia had insisted on joining the expedition, despite numerous objections to her presence. She'd armed herself with her father's hunting rifle and carried a satchel filled with the salt and iron preparations Dr. Vaughn had created. More importantly, she carried Kieran's letter, convinced that his words might provide crucial guidance in the trials ahead. The journey to the Perdido Mountains took 2 days of hard riding through increasingly desolate landscape. As they traveled, the very air seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on riders and horses alike with an oppressive weight that made conversation difficult and sleep fitful. Trees began displaying the twisted growth patterns Kieran had described, their bark scarred with symbols that hurt to look at directly. On the evening of the 2nd day, they made camp at the base of the mountain range, following Dr. Vaughn's instructions to create overlapping circles of salt and iron filings around their position. The horses grew increasingly restless as darkness fell, and Copperwind, who had accompanied them as both guide and reminder of their mission's urgency, began showing signs of the same eerie stillness that had marked her return to town. "They know we're here," whispered Widow Prescott, her eyes fixed on the mountain slopes above them. "I can feel them watching." Sheriff Cray checked his revolver for the 10th time, ensuring each chamber held one of Augustus's specially crafted bullets. "Let them watch. We didn't come this far to turn back at the first sign of trouble." As if summoned by his words, shapes began moving among the trees above their camp. At first, they appeared to be ordinary people, men and women in farming clothes, children skipping playfully between the pines. But as the figures drew closer, the truth of their nature became horrifyingly apparent. The missing families of the region stood at the edge of the firelight, their faces bearing familiar features twisted into expressions of inhuman hunger. Their eyes were pools of absolute darkness, and when they spoke, their voices carried harmonics that made the very air vibrate with malevolent intent. "You've come to join us," called a woman who had once been Mrs. Henderson, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "How thoughtful of you to bring so many friends. We've been so lonely since the Guardian began his vigil." The Guardian, Magnolia stepped forward despite Sheriff Cray's restraining hand. "You mean Kieran? What have you done to him?" A figure that bore Timothy Fletcher's face laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Done to him? Child, he did it to himself. The ritual transformed him into something neither living nor dead, bound to protect these mountain passes until his strength finally fails. Even now, he fights against his own nature, struggling to maintain his humanity while becoming more like us with each passing day." The revelation hit the expedition like a physical blow. Kieran wasn't just guarding against these creatures, he was slowly becoming one of them. His sacrifice incomplete, and his suffering ongoing. "Take us to him," Magnolia demanded. Raising her rifle with trembling hands, the transformed victim smiled, with teeth that gleamed like ivory daggers in the firelight. "Oh, we will. He's been calling for you, Magnolia, calling your name in the darkness, begging for release from his eternal watch. Come, and you can be together forever." The twisted figures led them higher into the mountains through paths that seemed to shift and change in the pre-dawn darkness, reality bending around their passage like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The expedition followed cautiously, their salt and iron protections creating a barrier that kept the creatures at arm's length, but couldn't entirely dispel the oppressive atmosphere of wrongness that permeated the peak's dot as they climbed. The very landscape told the story of an ongoing battle. Trees bore scorch marks from supernatural fire, and the ground was scarred with symbols that pulsed with faint, otherworldly light. In several clearings, they found evidence of desperate last-stand circles, of salt and ash where someone had made temporary sanctuary against relentless pursuit. "He's been fighting them for weeks," Dr. Vaughn observed, kneeling beside one of the ritual sites, holding them back through sheer force of will and whatever power the ritual granted him. At the highest peak, they found him. Kieran Holloway stood at the center of a vast circle carved into the living rock, his form flickering between the man they had known and something else entirely. Sometimes he appeared as he had in life, tall and strong, with gentle eyes and calloused hands. Other moments revealed the truth of his transformation. Translucent skin that showed the mountain landscape through his flesh, eyes that held depths of sorrow no living man could contain, and an aura of power that made the air itself fill with tension. "Magnolia," his voice carried across the mountaintop like wind through canyon walls. "Beautiful and terrible in equal measure. You shouldn't have come. None of you should have come." She stepped forward despite the warnings of her companions, tears streaming down her face as she took in the full extent of his sacrifice. "Kieran, we're here to help, to find a way to break whatever curse holds you." He smiled, the expression heartbreaking in its mixture of love and infinite sadness. "There is no curse, only choice. I chose to become this guardian, to hold these creatures in check until someone stronger could finish what I started. But I grow weaker each day, and they grow stronger. Soon I won't be able to maintain the barriers." The transformed victims circled the ritual site like wolves around a campfire, kept at bay by Kieran's presence, but clearly testing the boundaries of his power. More figures emerged from the forest with each passing minute, dozens of missing people, all bearing the same black eyes and predatory grins. "Tell us how to help," Sheriff Cray called out, his hand steady on his weapon despite the supernatural terror surrounding them. "There has to be something we can do." Kieran's form solidified as he focused his remaining strength. "The ritual I performed was incomplete, a desperate measure that traded my humanity for temporary power. But there is another way, one that Captain Sloan discovered in his research. It requires willing souls to stand together, to anchor the barrier with their combined life force rather than one person's sacrifice." Dr. Vaughn stepped forward, understanding immediately. A shared burden instead of individual martyrdom. "But what would that mean for us? You would remain human, but changed." connected to this place and responsible for its guardianship for the rest of your natural lives. Some would need to stay and maintain the barrier, while others could return home but would always feel the call of the mountains when danger threatened. The expedition members looked at each other, weighing the magnitude of the choice before them. To accept would mean permanent ties to this cursed place and ongoing responsibility for keeping ancient evils contained. To refuse would mean leaving Kieran to face inevitable defeat alone. Magnolia was the first to step forward. "I'll do it. If it means saving you and protecting our community, I'll do it." One by one, the others joined her. Sheriff Cray, Dr. Vaughn, Augustus Kane, even Widow Prescott with her weathered hands clasped in determination. 23 souls stood ready to share the burden that had been crushing one man's spirit. Kieran guided them through the ritual, his voice growing stronger as their combined will joined with his failing power. Light blazed from the carved circle, not the harsh glare of fire, but the warm radiance of dawn breaking over a peaceful valley. The transformed victims screamed and fled, their forms dissolving like smoke in the growing illumination. When the light faded, Kieran stood before them fully human once more, the terrible weight of guardianship now distributed among willing hearts. Some members of the expedition, including Dr. Vaughn and Augustus, chose to remain in the mountains as permanent guardians, establishing a settlement that would watch over the ancient prison. Others, including Kieran and Magnolia, returned to Dustwater Creek, though they carried within them the knowledge that they would answer the call. If ever the darkness stirred again, the threat was contained, the missing families laid to rest, and a community had learned that some battles require not individual heroism, but collective courage. In years to come, when travelers spoke of the mountain guardians and their vigilant watch, they would tell stories not of one man's sacrifice, but of 23 souls who chose to stand together. Against the darkness, Kieran and Magnolia married the following spring, their wedding blessed by the knowledge that some promises are worth keeping no matter the cost. And Copperwind, freed at last from the shadow that had haunted her, return, grazed peacefully in green pastures, her eyes clear and bright in the Texas sunshine.